For decades, Joel Goldsmith wrestled with one biblical passage that everyone misunderstood, a verse so powerful it held the secret to infinite supply, yet churches twisted it into guilt about material desires. What Jesus actually revealed in these words was so radical, so threatening to religious institutions' control over believers' lives and wallets, that its true meaning was buried under centuries of misinterpretation and fear-based teaching. The words, "Man shall not live by bread alone," have been weaponized by religious leaders to shame people for wanting financial security, for desiring comfortable homes, for seeking prosperity. These same leaders use this verse to keep their congregations poor and dependent while building golden cathedrals and living in luxury themselves. But Joel discovered the true meaning during his darkest financial crisis in 1946, and it changed everything he understood about prosperity, abundance, and the nature of supply itself. This isn't about rejecting money or living in artificial poverty to prove your spirituality. It's about understanding the invisible source that creates all material abundance, the consciousness that precedes and produces every form of supply. Once you grasp what Jesus meant by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, you'll never worry about supply again. The secret is consciousness itself, and Joel spent 40 years proving this principle works. Joel Goldsmith sat in his small San Francisco apartment in 1946 with exactly $17 to his name and rent due in 3 days. His spiritual practice seemed worthless when he couldn't pay basic bills. Every teaching about divine supply felt like empty philosophy while staring at disconnect notices and eviction warnings. That cold November night, desperate and exhausted, he finally understood what Jesus meant by this mysterious passage. The breakthrough came when Joel stopped begging God for money and started recognizing what "not by bread alone" actually indicated about the nature of reality and supply. Bread represents effect, the material world, the visible supply we can see and touch. But Jesus said we live by something else entirely, something invisible that produces the bread, something prior to and more powerful than material forms. That something is spiritual consciousness, infinite intelligence, divine awareness expressing as individual consciousness. Joel realized he'd been living as if matter created supply, as if the material world was cause rather than effect. He'd been praying to get things instead of recognizing the infinite source within his own awareness. Within 3 weeks of this fundamental shift in consciousness, opportunities flooded in from unexpected directions, not because God rewarded him for right thinking, but because he finally accessed the true source of all supply that had been present all along. Here's what Joel discovered about every word from the mouth of God that changes everything about how you relate to supply and abundance. This phrase doesn't mean literal words or biblical verses you memorize and repeat. It means the continuous flow of divine ideas, infinite intelligence, creative power, and spiritual guidance flowing through consciousness right now, in this moment. This flow never stops, never diminishes, never runs out, never depends on economic conditions or material circumstances. Most people live entirely by bread, by effects, by what already exists in the visible material world. They work only for money, trust only bank accounts, depend only on what they can see and touch. When that visible supply threatens to diminish, when the job is lost or the business fails or the economy crashes, absolute panic sets in because they have no awareness of the invisible source that creates all material forms in the first place. But when you understand you live by the infinite flow of divine consciousness expressing as ideas, opportunities, guidance, inspiration, and creative intelligence, you've accessed the source behind all material supply. The bread follows automatically as effect following cause. Joel proved this principle thousands of times over 40 years of teaching and demonstration, and he taught this consciousness to transform lives worldwide. This is the foundation of true abundance that never fails. The practical application is simpler than you think, but it requires a fundamental shift in your entire consciousness about supply and source. Every morning before rising, Joel would spend 30 minutes to an hour simply recognizing that infinite intelligence flows through his awareness, not praying for things, not begging for supply, not visualizing outcomes, but acknowledging the ever-present source already within him as his own consciousness. Throughout each day, instead of panicking about bills or lack, instead of obsessing over declining bank balances, He'd pause frequently and recognize the truth of his being. Divine ideas are flowing through my consciousness right now. Infinite intelligence knows the way forward and is revealing it to me. The same consciousness that creates galaxies and sustains universes is expressing as my individual awareness in this moment. This isn't positive thinking or affirmation. It's recognition of what's spiritually true, regardless of material appearances. When opportunities appeared, and they always did, he recognized them as the natural result of living by consciousness rather than by bread alone. When delays occurred or expected channels closed, he didn't interpret them as lack or failure, but as the intelligence of spirit timing things perfectly, closing wrong doors and opening right ones. This is how you live by every word from God's mouth, by constant awareness of the invisible source that creates all visible forms. A businesswoman named Margaret came to Joel's weekly classes in 1952, facing complete bankruptcy and financial ruin. Her successful boutique that had thrived for 8 years was suddenly failing. Creditors were threatening legal action, suppliers had cut her off, and she saw absolutely no way out of the disaster. She'd prayed desperately for money, for customers to return, for a miracle intervention, but nothing changed and the situation only worsened daily. Joel told her directly that she was living entirely by bread, depending completely on material forms, and missing the invisible source that creates all forms. For 2 weeks, Margaret practiced what Joel taught with growing desperation. Instead of obsessing over declining sales and mounting debts, she spent an hour each morning recognizing infinite intelligence flowing through her consciousness as the only source of her supply. She stopped seeing her business as her source and recognized consciousness itself as the eternal source. Then something unexpected happened that she never could have predicted or planned. A former customer from 5 years earlier called about a custom wedding dress order for her daughter, referring 5 wealthy friends who also wanted custom designs. Within 1 month, Margaret had more orders than she could handle and had to hire additional seamstresses. But here's what matters most. She recognized this wasn't luck or answered prayer in the traditional sense. It was the natural result of living by the word of God instead of bread alone. Joel encountered a failing farmer during his teaching tour in Hawaii who'd lost 2 consecutive crops to unexpected weather and was weeks away from losing his family land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The man was bitter, angry at God, and convinced he was being punished for some unknown sin. Joel asked him a direct question that changed his entire perspective. Are you living by the crops you grow, or by the intelligence that knows how to grow them? The farmer didn't understand at first and thought Joel was mocking his situation. Joel explained patiently that he'd placed all his faith in effects, in the crops themselves, making them his God and his source. He'd completely forgotten the invisible source of all agriculture, the divine intelligence that knows every weather pattern, every soil need, every perfect timing for planting and harvesting. He was living entirely by bread, by material forms, and ignoring the consciousness that creates those forms. Over the next 3 months, the farmer practiced recognition of infinite intelligence guiding his every decision about the land. He planted different crops based on inner guidance rather than conventional wisdom or what neighbors were planting. He changed his entire irrigation approach based on an idea that came during morning meditation. The next harvest was his most profitable in 20 years, and he finally understood why. He'd shifted from living by bread alone to living by the word of God. A widow named Ruth faced eviction with 3 young children after her husband's unexpected death left them with nothing but debts and a small insurance policy that barely covered funeral expenses. Local churches offered temporary food assistance, but no lasting solution to her desperate situation. She attended Joel's evening lecture in desperation, hoping for some magical answer. When he explained, "Man shall not live by bread alone," she initially felt offended and angry. She needed bread desperately. How dare he suggest material supply didn't matter? But Joel clarified with compassion what Jesus actually meant by these words. "You absolutely need bread," he said. "Material supply is necessary and good. But bread isn't your source. Consciousness is. The moment you recognize infinite intelligence as your only true supply, you've opened yourself to receive from directions you cannot possibly imagine or predict right now. Your human mind cannot conceive the channels through which divine consciousness will provide. Ruth decided she had nothing left to lose by trying this completely different approach. She stopped frantic job searching that yielded nothing and spent each morning recognizing divine ideas flowing through her awareness as her true supply. Within 5 days, a former neighbor she barely remembered offered her part-time bookkeeping work that became full-time within 2 weeks. Her landlord unexpectedly extended her lease at reduced rent after his daughter experienced similar hardship. A distant relative she'd met once at her wedding sent unexpected financial help. Ruth learned experientially that living by God's word means trusting the invisible source that creates all visible supply. These transformation stories reveal the consistent pattern Joel discovered and proved over 40 years of teaching this consciousness principle worldwide. The supply comes not from where you logically expect, not from your current job or situation or connections, but from the infinite creativity of divine consciousness expressing in completely unexpected ways that your human mind could never plan or predict. This is precisely why living by bread alone always leads to limitation, fear, and eventual failure. When you live by consciousness, by recognizing and depending on the infinite flow of divine ideas and intelligence as your only source, you've accessed the cause that creates all material effects. The bread follows naturally and inevitably, but you're no longer slavishly dependent on any particular form of bread or any specific channel of supply. You're dependent only on the inexhaustible source behind all forms, the consciousness that never depletes, never fails, never runs out regardless of outer circumstances. Joel taught this principle to thousands of students across 5 continents who proved it repeatedly in their own lives through consistent practice. Teachers found new positions in different cities. Businesses discovered unexpected markets they never knew existed. Families received help from surprising sources they never would have thought to ask. Not because they prayed harder or were more deserving, but because they stopped living by effects and started living by cause, by consciousness itself as the only source of all supply. If these transformation stories inspire you to shift from bread consciousness to God consciousness, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's wisdom, subscribe for more teachings on true abundance and mystical Christianity, and comment which story resonated most with your current financial or supply situation. Let's build a conscious community. Beyond simple recognition of infinite intelligence, Joel taught a complementary practice he called resting in the Word, that deepens your consciousness of omnipresent supply. This means spending time each day, ideally morning and evening, simply being aware of divine consciousness without asking for anything, without trying to make anything happen, without even thinking about your needs or desires. Just recognizing what is already eternally true in the spiritual dimension of reality. Most people approach spirituality exactly like begging at heaven's door, which is why their prayers seem unanswered. They pray desperately for this, visualize frantically for that, affirm endlessly for the other thing, always trying to get something from God as if God were withholding supply until they perform the right spiritual technique. But Joel discovered through direct experience that infinite supply is already flowing, already complete, already fully present in consciousness right now. Your work isn't to create it, attract it, or earn it, but simply to recognize what already exists. When you rest in quiet awareness of the infinite word proceeding from God's mouth right now, in this present moment, you naturally align with the source of all supply. Ideas begin to flow effortlessly into your conscious awareness. Guidance becomes crystal clear without struggle or confusion. Opportunities appear in your experience because you're no longer blocking the natural flow with desperate grabbing at material effects. You're living by the word, by consciousness itself, and the bread follows as naturally as fruit follows a healthy tree. Joel taught another powerful technique he called recognizing I as infinite, that fundamentally shifts your identity from limited human to the infinite consciousness expressing as your individual awareness. When you realize, I am not this limited person living by bread alone, I am the infinite awareness living by every word of God, everything changes in your experience of supply and abundance. This recognition dissolves the sense of separation from your source that creates all feelings of lack and limitation. This isn't ego inflation or pretending to be God in some grandiose delusional sense. It's recognizing the truth of consciousness that mystics have taught for millennia. The I that is aware in you, the consciousness that knows you exist, is not separate from the infinite I that creates galaxies, that knows all things, that is the source of all supply throughout the universe. When you recognize this fundamental truth, you've stopped living by effects and started living by cause, by the infinite source itself. Practice this recognition daily, especially during morning meditation. Sit quietly and recognize with growing certainty, I am infinite consciousness. The awareness in me is the awareness that creates and sustains all things. I live by this infinite intelligence, not by any temporary material form. This simple recognition, practiced consistently over weeks and months, gradually dissolves the deep fear and sense of limitation that comes from living by bread alone. You begin experiencing yourself as the infinite source expressing individually. Joel also taught the essential practice of seeing through appearances that allows you to maintain your consciousness of infinite supply even when material circumstances look desperate or frightening, when lack appears, when bills pile up faster than income, when the bank account dwindles toward zero. These are appearances in the material world, effects at the bread level of reality. But they're not the truth of consciousness, not the reality of infinite supply flowing through divine ideas right now in the invisible dimension. The technique is simple in concept, but requires practice to master. When facing any appearance of lack, limitation, or loss, pause before reacting emotionally and recognize the spiritual truth behind the appearance. Infinite intelligence is flowing right now, regardless of what appears. Divine ideas are present in my consciousness this very moment, creating new forms of supply. The source of all abundance is operating as my awareness. I live by the Word of God, not by the temporary appearance of bread alone. This isn't denial of practical situations or pretending problems don't exist. You still pay bills, still take responsible action, still function intelligently in the material world. But you're no longer terrorized by appearances or paralyzed by fear, because you know with certainty their effects, not cause. You're living by consciousness. The eternal cause and effects must eventually align with the reality of infinite supply that exists in consciousness first, then manifests in material form as demonstration. The final complementary technique Joel taught for maintaining consciousness of supply was practicing the presence throughout every moment of your day. This means maintaining continuous awareness, not just during meditation, that infinite intelligence is present, active, and expressing through you right now in this moment. You're living by the Word of God, not just when you remember, but as your constant state of being. While working at your desk, while driving your car, while cooking dinner, while paying bills or having conversations, maintain subtle background awareness that divine consciousness is operating as your individual awareness. This omnipresent intelligence is the true source of all your supply, all your ideas, all your opportunities and solutions. The more consistently you practice recognizing this presence in every moment, the more naturally and effortlessly abundance flows into your material experience without struggle or strain. Joel lived this way constantly for the last 30 years of his life. Students and colleagues noted that he had an unusual peace and confidence about material concerns that seemed almost superhuman. He trusted the invisible source completely and absolutely because he'd proven it utterly reliable through thousands of demonstrations over decades. This is the ultimate goal of practice, to shift from living by bread alone to living by continuous conscious awareness of infinite intelligence as your only source in every moment. But let's address the realistic challenges you'll face practicing this principle, because Joel was always honest about obstacles rather than pretending the path is easy. The biggest challenge Joel encountered repeatedly in students was the powerful temptation to return to living by bread when material circumstances looked genuinely frightening. When the bank account actually hits zero, when the job truly disappears, when health genuinely fails, the ego screams with primal terror to abandon consciousness and grab desperately at any material solution. This reaction is completely natural and human, hardwired into our survival instincts. Joel never shamed people for these moments of fear or regression to bread consciousness. He acknowledged with compassion that shifting from material dependence to consciousness, dependence takes consistent practice, persistent effort, and time to develop. You will wobble, You will doubt. You will panic sometimes and forget everything you learned. The crucial question isn't whether you experience fear, but whether you return to the practice of recognition or abandon it entirely for bread consciousness alone. One student told Joel she practiced recognition faithfully for 3 weeks, felt growing confidence, but when her car unexpectedly broke down and she completely lacked repair money, she forgot everything instantly and spiraled into absolute panic for 2 days. Joel smiled with understanding and said this was perfectly normal for someone still developing their consciousness. The practice isn't achieving perfection or never experiencing fear again. It's repeatedly returning to recognition of the invisible source whenever you catch yourself living by bread alone. Another common challenge that defeats many students is the frustrating time lag between consciousness recognition and material manifestation. You practice faithful recognition of infinite intelligence. You stop living by bread alone. You maintain awareness of the invisible source. But the material supply doesn't instantly appear in your experience. Bills still come due on schedule. Lack still seems painfully present, and corrosive doubt creeps in, questioning whether any of this spiritual teaching actually works in the real world. This is precisely where most people abandon the practice entirely and return to bread consciousness, declaring spiritual principles impractical fantasy. Joel taught patience and persistent faith through this challenging period. The invisible source is already operating in response to your recognition, already responding to your consciousness, already creating the forms and channels through which supply will appear in your material experience. But divine intelligence works in ways and timing you simply cannot predict, control, or understand from the limited human level of consciousness. He compared this process to planting seeds in a garden. You don't frantically dig up seeds every single day to check their progress or see if they're growing. You trust completely that the invisible life force is working beneath the surface, following laws you don't fully understand, but that operate perfectly. Similarly, when you plant recognition of infinite consciousness as your source, trust with absolute certainty that the invisible source is already creating the specific channels through which abundance will flow into your experience. Living by the word requires developing faith in what you cannot yet see with physical eyes. A third challenge Joel addressed repeatedly is guilt about desiring material things and enjoying physical abundance. Students constantly asked if wanting money, beautiful homes, comfortable lives, or material pleasures meant they were still living by bread alone and failing spiritually. This confusion kept sincere spiritual seekers stuck in artificial poverty, afraid that desiring abundance somehow violated spiritual principles or proved their consciousness was still material. Joel was emphatic and crystal clear about this misunderstanding. You're absolutely supposed to enjoy material abundance fully. God's will is infinite abundance for all creation. The issue isn't having bread or enjoying bread. It's living by bread as if material forms were your source rather than consciousness. You can enjoy a beautiful home, prosperous business, financial security, physical comfort, and abundant health while living completely by consciousness. Material enjoyment and spiritual consciousness aren't opposites, they're natural partners. The crucial difference is where you place your ultimate dependence and what you recognize as your actual source. If you think your job is your source of supply, you're living by bread and will experience fear when that job is threatened. If you recognize infinite intelligence as your only source, and your job is simply one temporary channel through which it flows, you're living by the word of God. Enjoy the bread fully and gratefully, but always know with certainty where it truly comes from. The source is consciousness. The bread is simply the effect made visible. The final major challenge is dealing with other people's opinions, judgments, and pressure when you start practicing this consciousness principle. When you stop desperately chasing material solutions and start depending on recognition of infinite source, people think you're being impractical, irresponsible, or living in delusional fantasy. Family members pressure you intensely to face reality and stop with spiritual nonsense when bills need paying and practical problems need solving. Joel faced this criticism constantly throughout his teaching career. Critics called him dangerously irresponsible for teaching people to depend on invisible consciousness instead of working harder, saving more, or pursuing conventional material solutions. Religious leaders attacked him for undermining faith in traditional prayer. Materialists mocked him for believing in anything beyond physical reality. But he'd proven over 4 decades that living by the Word of God produced more consistent, reliable, abundant supply than living by bread alone ever could. The consistent results spoke for themselves more powerfully than any argument. Your challenge is maintaining your practice faithfully, despite outer skepticism, ridicule, or pressure from well-meaning people who don't understand consciousness principles. You don't need to convince anyone, defend your approach, or prove anything to skeptics. Simply practice daily recognition of infinite intelligence as your only source. Take inspired action as guidance comes clearly, and let the results prove the principle in your own experience. Eventually, even the harshest skeptics will notice something different and unexplainable about your supply and abundance. If these challenge-breaking insights resonate with your current struggles, like this video to support spiritual truth that actually works. Subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings on consciousness, and comment which specific obstacle you're ready to overcome right now through recognition of infinite source. Now let's explore advanced integration of this principle in daily practical life beyond morning meditation. Joel taught that living by the Word of God must become a moment-by-moment practice woven into every activity, not just something you do during quiet meditation time. When you receive an unexpected bill, that's your immediate opportunity to practice recognition of infinite intelligence, instead of reacting automatically in fear at the bread level of appearances. A business owner who studied with Joel for 5 years described his gradual transformation in handling financial challenges. When facing a large, unexpected expense that his current cash flow couldn't cover, his first automatic impulse was still panic and fear, even after years of practice. But he'd trained himself through persistent repetition to pause before reacting and recognize the spiritual truth. I live by infinite consciousness, not by what appears at the material bread level. Divine intelligence knows the perfect way through this situation and is already creating the specific solution. He didn't ignore the bill, pretend it didn't exist, or act irresponsibly. He simply refused to give it power as his source or his destroyer. He recognized consciousness as his only true source, took practical steps as guidance came clearly through meditation, and remained completely open to unexpected solutions his human mind couldn't plan. Within days, a delayed payment arrived unexpectedly from a client he'd given up on, and a new client signed a contract he hadn't been pursuing, covering the expense completely with money left over. This is living by the Word in practical daily life. Joel taught advanced students to practice this consciousness principle specifically during financial decisions and planning. Instead of making choices based only on current bank balance, available credit, or visible material resources, include recognition of infinite intelligence as a legitimate factor in your decision-making process. This doesn't mean being foolish, reckless, or irresponsible with money in the name of faith or spirituality. A woman considering expanding her small but stable business felt completely torn between competing factors. The financial numbers and conventional business logic said clearly she couldn't afford expansion at this time, but a strong, persistent inner guidance kept saying firmly to move forward now. She practiced what Joel taught, spending weeks recognizing infinite intelligence as her true source, not her current bank balance or available credit. Finally, she moved forward carefully with the expansion, taking practical steps while maintaining continuous consciousness of the invisible source. The expansion succeeded far beyond her most optimistic projections in ways she never could have predicted through business planning. But more importantly than the material success, she learned to include spiritual recognition as a practical factor in material decisions. She wasn't being reckless with money or ignoring practical realities. She was learning to live by both the Word and the bread simultaneously, recognizing consciousness as ultimate source while functioning responsibly and intelligently in the material world. This delicate balance is the advanced practice Joel demonstrated perfectly throughout his own life and business affairs. Another advanced application involves relationships and service to others from consciousness of infinite supply. When you truly recognize infinite intelligence as your only source, you become completely free to give generously, serve abundantly, and help others without any fear of depleting your own supply or creating lack for yourself. You're living by and depending on an absolutely inexhaustible source, not by the limited bread of material resources alone that can be diminished through giving. Joel practiced radical generosity throughout his teaching career because he understood this principle in his very bones through decades of proof. He gave healing work freely and fully to those who genuinely couldn't pay, knowing with certainty his supply came from consciousness, not from clients' payments. He shared his deepest teachings globally through books and lectures, trusting infinite intelligence to provide through whatever channels it chose. And in 40 years of this generous practice, he never lacked for anything and lived in comfortable abundance until his death. You can begin practicing this same consciousness immediately at whatever level feels comfortable. Give according to inner guidance without calculating material return. Serve generously where you feel genuinely called. Trust the invisible source to replenish and multiply through channels you cannot predict. This isn't about giving recklessly, letting people take advantage of you, or depleting yourself to prove your faith. It's about living by consciousness so completely and fully that you're genuinely free from fear-based hoarding of material resources because you know the source never depletes. The most advanced integration Joel taught, and the one most students fail to achieve, is maintaining recognition of infinite source, even during success and material abundance. The real test of consciousness isn't trusting the invisible source when you're poor and desperate with nothing to lose. It's continuing to live by the word when the bread is plentiful, and material success tempts you back into bread consciousness. Success and abundance can trick you back into material dependence faster and more subtly than lack ever could. A wealthy student who'd built a multi-million-dollar business confessed honestly to Joel that once his success arrived and stabilized, he gradually forgot the consciousness practice that originally created the success. He slowly started living by his business success, by his impressive bank balance, by his material achievements and possessions. Fear slowly and insidiously returned, because he'd unconsciously made the bread his source again, instead of maintaining recognition of consciousness as the eternal source behind all the temporary material forms. Joel reminded him with compassionate firmness that abundance doesn't eliminate the need for this daily practice. It actually intensifies the need for vigilance. When you have abundant material supply, the subtle temptation to depend on what you have instead of the consciousness that created it is far more powerful and seductive than obvious lack. The truly advanced practice is living by the Word of God with equal faith and recognition whether you have $17 or $17 million in the bank. The amount of bread never matters when you know the source. Now we arrive at the total transformation this principle creates over months and years of faithful, consistent practice. After sustained practice of recognizing infinite consciousness as your only source, something profound shifts in your entire relationship with material reality and supply. Fear of lack dissolves completely, not because you have more material wealth, but because you understand with unshakable certainty the inexhaustible nature of the source you're living by. Joel described this state as achieving consciousness of omnipresent supply that becomes your permanent awareness rather than something you have to work to remember. You know with absolute certainty, beyond any doubt or question, that infinite intelligence is always present, always flowing, always creating new forms of abundance regardless of outer circumstances. You're no longer at the mercy of economic conditions, job security, stock market crashes, or any material circumstances because you're living by something that completely transcends all material limitations. This elevated consciousness doesn't mean material problems or challenges never appear in your experience. It means they no longer terrorize you, paralyze you, or control your emotional state. You face financial challenges with quiet inner confidence that infinite intelligence already knows the perfect way through and is already creating the solution. You take practical action without desperate attachment to specific outcomes. You trust the invisible source completely and absolutely because you've proven it utterly reliable through repeated direct experience over time. The transformation extends far beyond personal supply into how you view and experience all of life and reality. When you truly understand at the deepest level that consciousness is source and not material forms, you begin seeing everyone and everything as direct expression of the one infinite intelligence. Separation consciousness gradually dissolves into recognition of one universal source expressing as infinite individual forms. Joel taught that this expanded recognition is the absolute foundation of genuine spiritual healing and lasting transformation. When you know with certainty that you and others live by the Word of God, by infinite consciousness rather than by material circumstances alone, you can genuinely help others access their own infinite source instead of trying to manipulate material effects. You're no longer limited to material solutions for what are fundamentally spiritual problems of consciousness. This is precisely how Joel performed thousands of documented spiritual healings over 40 years of teaching and practice. He consistently recognized that neither he nor those seeking help lived by bread alone, by material conditions or physical circumstances. Both lived by infinite consciousness expressing as their very awareness and being. This unwavering recognition lifted people into their own direct realization of omnipresent supply, omnipresent health, omnipresent wholeness already present in consciousness, which then manifested as healing in the material realm. The practical transformation in daily life becomes increasingly remarkable as this consciousness deepens through practice. You make decisions from a completely different place of awareness, no longer driven by fear of lack or desperate grabbing at material security. You're guided naturally by inner wisdom, by the continuous flow of divine ideas, by infinite intelligence expressing directly through your individual consciousness as clear guidance. Opportunities appear naturally and effortlessly in your experience because you're no longer blocking the natural flow with fear-based consciousness and desperate manipulation. Relationships improve dramatically because you're not unconsciously using people as your source or depending on them for your supply. Physical health often improves significantly because you've stopped living by body consciousness alone and recognized consciousness itself as the true source of all life, vitality, and wholeness. Joel lived this completely transformed life for the final decades of his teaching career, demonstrating daily that this principle isn't abstract theory, but practical, livable reality. He traveled the entire world sharing these teachings, touched millions of lives through books and lectures, never lacked for anything material or spiritual, and maintained peaceful, unwavering trust in the invisible source until his death at 73. This same transformation is absolutely available to you through persistent, dedicated practice of living by every word that proceeds from God's mouth. So here's the complete truth of what Jesus actually meant by, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Stop depending on material forms as your source of supply, security, or happiness. Recognize that infinite consciousness, divine intelligence, spiritual awareness, is the one and only source of all material abundance in your experience. The bread is always effect, consciousness is always cause. Practice daily recognition that infinite ideas are flowing through your individual awareness right now in this present moment. Trust this invisible source completely and absolutely, while taking practical inspired action as guidance comes clearly. Persist faithfully through challenges, frustrating time lags, and recurring doubts. Return again and again to recognition of consciousness as your only source, until this becomes your permanent living reality, rather than something you have to work to remember. Joel Goldsmith proved this principle works consistently over 40 years of teaching and personal demonstration in every area of life. Thousands of sincere students proved it repeatedly in their own diverse life circumstances. Now it's your turn to make the shift from living by bread alone to living by the infinite Word of God. Your complete supply already exists in consciousness right now, waiting only for your recognition to manifest as material demonstration. If Joel Goldsmith's teaching transformed your understanding of abundance and source, like this video to spread this consciousness to others, subscribe for more mystical Christianity secrets, and comment, "I live by the Word," to confirm your personal shift from bread consciousness to God consciousness. Welcome to Infinite Supply. For decades, Joel Goldsmith watched students struggle with forgiveness, carrying resentment like chains around their souls. Then he discovered something revolutionary in Christ's teaching about forgiving 70 times 7. This wasn't about the other person at all. It was about your freedom from the prison of judgment. The number wasn't literal. It was infinite release from your own mental bondage. What Joel realized transformed his entire healing practice. When you forgive, you're not pardoning someone's behavior or saying what they did was acceptable. You're releasing the energetic cord that binds you to that painful memory. Every time you replay the hurt, you reinforce your own suffering. Forgiveness is the spiritual surgery that cuts you free from continuous self-inflicted pain. The mystic understood that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Your resentment doesn't touch them, it only corrodes your consciousness. It blocks the flow of divine grace through you. It keeps you trapped in a past moment, unable to receive the present gift of God's presence. This teaching isn't moral obligation. It's practical spiritual technology for your liberation. Joel discovered that most people misunderstand forgiveness as a single event, like signing a contract. They say the words once and expect the feeling to vanish. But Christ's 70 times 7 reveals a profound truth about consciousness. Forgiveness is a practice, not a performance. Each time the memory returns with its sting, you forgive again. Not because you failed the first time, but because healing happens in layers. Your consciousness has been conditioned over years to react with hurt, anger, or betrayal. These neural pathways don't dissolve instantly. Joel taught that each act of forgiveness weakens the emotional charge attached to the memory. The first forgiveness might reduce the pain by 10%. The second by another 10%. Gradually, through persistent practice, the memory loses its power to disturb your peace. This is why Jesus didn't say forgive once perfectly. He said 70 times 7, acknowledging the reality of how consciousness transforms. It's like washing a deeply stained cloth. One wash lightens it, but complete cleaning requires multiple cycles. Your willingness to forgive repeatedly demonstrates your commitment to your own spiritual freedom over the satisfaction of holding grudges. Joel Goldsmith observed something fascinating in his healing work. The people who couldn't heal physically were often those who couldn't forgive emotionally. There's a direct connection between holding resentment and blocking the flow of life force through your body. Unforgiveness creates energetic knots in your consciousness that manifest as tension, disease, and chronic conditions. Your body becomes the battlefield for your mental warfare. When you refuse to forgive, you're essentially saying that your right to judge is more important than your peace, your health, your joy. You're valuing the story of your victimhood over your present well-being. Joel would ask his students a powerful question. How much of your life force are you willing to sacrifice to prove someone wrong? The cost of unforgiveness is always higher than your ego wants to admit. The practice of forgiving 70 times 7 trains you to value freedom over being right. Each forgiveness is a choice to reclaim your energy from the past and invest it in your present consciousness. It's not weakness, it's the ultimate power move. You're declaring that no person, no event, no circumstance has the authority to keep you imprisoned in suffering. You alone hold the key to your cell. Here's what Joel discovered that revolutionized his understanding. The person you need to forgive most isn't necessarily the one who hurt you, it's often yourself. You're angry at yourself for trusting them, for not seeing the warning signs, for being vulnerable, for not protecting yourself better. The outer forgiveness is important, but the inner forgiveness is essential. You must forgive yourself 70 times 7 for being human. This self-forgiveness breaks the cycle of shame that keeps you repeating painful patterns. When you condemn yourself for past choices, you lower your consciousness to the level where those experiences occur. Forgiveness raises your vibration back to wholeness. It doesn't erase what happened, but it releases the emotional charge that keeps attracting similar circumstances. You stop being a vibrational match for betrayal when you forgive the betrayer within. Joel taught that complete forgiveness includes everyone involved, including yourself and even God. If you've been angry at the divine for allowing your suffering, this comprehensive release creates space for grace to flood your consciousness. You're not just forgiving an action, you're forgiving the entire situation, seeing it as part of your spiritual curriculum rather than your destruction. This shift changes everything. Joel once worked with a woman named Sarah who'd been betrayed by her business partner 15 years earlier. She lost everything financially and rebuilt her life, but the resentment remained like a low-grade fever in her consciousness. Every business decision was filtered through fear of betrayal. She couldn't fully trust anyone, which meant she couldn't fully succeed. Her unforgiveness was costing her more than the original betrayal ever did. Joel guided her through the 70 times 7 practice. At first, she resisted, saying the partner didn't deserve forgiveness. Joel gently reminded her this wasn't about deserving, it was about her freedom. They worked together for 3 months. Some days, she'd forgive once. Other days, she'd need to forgive 20 times as memories flooded back. Gradually, the emotional intensity diminished like a fire running out of fuel. 6 months into the practice, something shifted. Sarah realized she no longer thought about the betrayal daily. When the memory did surface, it felt distant, like a story about someone else. More importantly, her business began thriving in ways it never had before. She could trust her intuition again, partner with others, take healthy risks. The forgiveness didn't change what happened, but it completely changed what was happening now in her life. Another student, Michael, struggled with forgiving his father for decades of emotional abuse. Joel explained that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation or even communication with the person. It's an internal release that happens in your consciousness regardless of the other person's awareness, presence, or even their life or death. You're not waiting for them to apologize or change. You're changing your relationship to the memory itself. Michael practiced daily, and for weeks nothing seemed to shift. He felt like a failure at forgiveness. Joel reassured him that the practice was working beneath the surface, like seeds germinating underground before any green shoot appears. The key was persistence without measuring results. Forgiveness isn't about feeling better immediately. It's about commitment to freedom over time. Trust the process even when you can't see the progress. After 2 months, Michael had a dream where he saw his father as a wounded child, acting from his own unhealed pain. This perspective didn't excuse the abuse, but it dissolved the personal offense. His father wasn't attacking him specifically, he was reacting from his own suffering. This recognition broke the energetic cord between them. Michael woke up feeling lighter than he had in 30 years. The practice had worked its magic in his subconscious mind. Joel also encountered students who used forgiveness as spiritual bypass, pretending everything was fine while suppressing their authentic feelings. This false forgiveness is actually another form of imprisonment. You're not releasing the pain, you're denying it exists. True forgiveness acknowledges the hurt fully before releasing it. You must feel it to heal it. Trying to forgive before processing the pain is like trying to heal a wound without cleaning it first. The 70x7 practice allows space for this honesty. The first several times you forgive, you might still be angry, and that's acceptable. You're training your consciousness toward freedom while respecting where you actually are emotionally. Joel taught that authentic forgiveness has a quality of softening, not hardening. If your forgiveness feels rigid or forced, you're probably operating from willpower rather than genuine release. The distinction is crucial for your spiritual integrity. Willpower says, I should forgive, so I will ignore my feelings. Genuine forgiveness says, I acknowledge this hurt deeply, and I choose to release my attachment to it for my own liberation. One is suppression dressed as spirituality. The other is transformation through conscious choice. Joel always emphasized working with your actual consciousness, not your ideal consciousness. The most profound shift Joel witnessed came from a woman who'd lost her child to a drunk driver. For years, her entire identity became the grieving mother consumed by rage. Forgiveness seemed impossible, even obscene. How could she forgive such devastation? Joel didn't push, he simply asked, how much of your remaining life are you willing to sacrifice to your anger? Your other children need a present mother, not a ghost consumed by the past. This question pierced her consciousness. She realized her unforgiveness wasn't honoring her lost child. It was preventing her from fully loving her living children. She began the practice with excruciating difficulty. Some days she could barely whisper one forgiveness. Other days she'd rage and cry for hours before attempting it. Joel reminded her that willingness is enough. You don't need to feel forgiving. You only need to be willing to work toward it. Over 18 months, a miraculous transformation occurred. She found peace without betraying her child's memory. She could honor the grief while releasing the consuming rage. She started a foundation in her child's name, turning tragedy into service. The forgiveness freed her to create meaning from the meaningless, to transform her pain into purpose. She became truly alive again, which was the greatest tribute she could offer to the child she lost. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more, Joel Goldsmith Wisdom, and comment, what healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond the emotional practice, Joel taught specific techniques to support the 70x7 process. The first is the consciousness of impersonalization. When someone wrongs you, they're not acting as their true spiritual self. They're acting from their conditioned, wounded ego. The person you need to forgive isn't really them. It's the false self operating through them. This distinction allows you to separate the person from the behavior. Joel would guide students to visualize the person surrounded by divine light, seeing past their actions to their spiritual essence. This doesn't justify harmful behavior, but it removes the personal offense. You recognize that hurt people, and everyone is doing the best they can from their current level of consciousness. When you see this clearly, forgiveness becomes easier because you're not taking their actions as a personal indictment of your worth. The practice looks like this. When the memory arises, pause and say, "I forgive the wounded consciousness that acted through this person. I release my attachment to this experience. I am free, and I recognize their spiritual innocence beneath their human mistakes." Repeat as often as needed. Some days you'll need this once, other days 70 times. Trust that each repetition is loosening the energetic grip of resentment on your soul. The second technique Joel emphasized is the practice of substituting love for judgment. Every time you catch yourself mentally rehearsing the offense, consciously replace that thought with a blessing for the person. This feels impossible at first, even hypocritical. But Joel taught that you're not blessing their actions, you're blessing their being. You're affirming the divine presence within them, calling forth their highest self rather than reinforcing their lowest behavior. This practice actively rewires your neural pathways from reaction to response. Initially, you might manage this substitution once out of every 100 thoughts. That's perfect progress. Over weeks and months, the ratio shifts. Eventually, the blessing becomes more automatic than the resentment. You're literally reprogramming your consciousness from a frequency of attack to a frequency of grace. This is advanced spiritual technology disguised as simple forgiveness. Joel used this technique himself when students or colleagues disappointed him. Instead of indulging irritation, he'd silently speak to their divine consciousness, blessing them with clarity, wisdom, and peace. He noticed that this practice not only freed him from negativity, but often the other person would spontaneously shift their behavior without any outer confrontation. Your change in consciousness changes the entire relationship dynamic energetically. The third practice is what Joel called the meditation of release. Set aside 15 minutes daily in quiet contemplation. Bring to mind the person or situation requiring forgiveness. Don't push the feelings away. Let them surface fully. Feel the anger, the hurt, the betrayal in your body. Notice where it lives as tension, tightness, or pain. Then consciously breathe into those areas, imagining divine light dissolving the emotional density with each exhale. As you breathe, silently repeat, "I release this to the divine. This is no longer mine to carry. I am free from this now." You may need to repeat this hundreds of times in one session. That's the 70 times 7 in action. You're not trying to force a feeling of forgiveness. You're creating the conditions for organic release. Some days you'll feel lighter afterward. Other days nothing seems to shift. Continue anyway. Trust accumulates beneath awareness. Joel emphasized that this meditation works with your body's wisdom, not just your mind's intention. Unforgiveness is stored in your cellular memory, your nervous system, your energetic field. By bringing conscious breath and attention to where you hold the pain physically, you're releasing it at the somatic level. This creates lasting transformation rather than temporary mental agreement to forgive. Your whole being participates in the liberation process. The fourth technique combines journaling with the forgiveness practice. Write a letter to the person you're forgiving, not to send, but to release. Pour everything out honestly without editing or spiritualizing your feelings. Express your rage, your hurt, your sense of betrayal completely. This isn't about being nice, it's about being real. Let the page hold what your consciousness can no longer carry. Some students write dozens of these letters over months. After you've emptied all the pain onto paper, write a second letter from your highest self. This letter offers forgiveness, not from obligation, but from recognition of your shared humanity. Acknowledge that everyone makes mistakes from their level of consciousness. Express your choice to release the burden of judgment for your own well-being. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it frees you from the prison of perpetual resentment. Finally, ceremonially release both letters. Some students burn them, others bury them. Some tear them into pieces and scatter them in water. The physical act of destruction symbolizes the energetic release you're creating in consciousness. Joel taught that ritual engages your subconscious mind powerfully, making abstract forgiveness concrete and final. Your whole being witnesses the release, and transformation deepens through this multisensory commitment to freedom. Despite these powerful practices, Joel acknowledged that students encounter predictable obstacles in the forgiveness journey. The first major challenge is the ego's investment in victimhood. There's a perverse comfort in being the wronged party. It gives you moral superiority, it justifies your struggles, it earns sympathy from others. Forgiveness requires releasing this identity, which can feel like losing yourself entirely if you've built your life around your wounds. Joel compassionately confronted this pattern when he saw it. He'd ask, "Who would you be without this story? What scares you more, staying in suffering or discovering joy?" These questions reveal how we sometimes prefer familiar pain to unknown peace. The ego fears that forgiveness means the other person wins, that your pain didn't matter, that you'll be vulnerable to future hurt. None of this is true, but the fear feels real. The way through this obstacle is recognizing that your value doesn't depend on your victim status. You're worthy of love, respect, and good treatment because of your divine nature, not because of what was done to you. Forgiveness doesn't diminish your experience. It honors it by refusing to let it define your future. You're too valuable to spend your precious life maintaining grievances. Your freedom matters more than your story. The second major obstacle is the fear that forgiveness equals condoning harmful behavior. Joel clarified this misconception repeatedly. Forgiveness is not saying what happened was acceptable, not inviting repeated harm, not staying in dangerous situations. You can forgive completely while maintaining firm boundaries, ending toxic relationships, and even pursuing legal justice where appropriate. Forgiveness is an internal release, not an external reconciliation requirement. Many students confused forgiveness with resuming relationship as if nothing happened. Joel taught that wisdom sometimes requires distance, even after forgiveness. You release the emotional charge while honoring the practical reality that some people aren't safe for you. Forgiveness frees you from resentment, but boundaries protect you from repeated harm. Both are expressions of self-love and spiritual maturity, not contradictions. The distinction is crucial for your safety and sanity. You can bless someone from afar, wish them well spiritually, release all judgment, and still never speak to them again. Forgiveness happens in your consciousness regardless of their presence in your physical life. Joel himself maintained healthy distance from certain individuals, even while holding no personal offense in his heart. Spiritual freedom and practical wisdom walk hand in hand. The third obstacle is impatience with the process. Students often expect that after forgiving once or even 70 times 7 times in one session, the issue should be resolved forever. When the hurt resurfaces days or weeks later, they feel like failures. Joel reminded them that consciousness healing doesn't follow linear time. Memories are triggered by unexpected events, smells, songs, places. Each trigger is another opportunity to practice, not evidence of spiritual inadequacy. He compared it to physical healing. If you cut your finger deeply, you don't expect it to heal instantly. You clean it, bandage it, protect it, and gradually new tissue forms. Some days it hurts more than others. Eventually, it heals completely, leaving perhaps a small scar as a reminder, but no longer causing pain. Emotional and spiritual healing follows the same organic process. Your impatience doesn't accelerate healing. Your patience creates conditions for natural restoration. The 70 times 7 teaching anticipates this reality. Christ knew that forgiveness isn't one and done. It's a practice that accompanies you through the healing journey, however long that takes. Instead of judging yourself when you need to forgive again, celebrate your willingness to continue the practice. Each forgiveness is a victory, not a failure. Persistence is the path to freedom, and you're walking it perfectly even when it feels imperfect. The fourth challenge is forgiving without receiving an apology or acknowledgement. The other person may not think they did anything wrong, may have died, may be unreachable or unsafe to contact. Your ego wants validation, wants them to admit they hurt you, wants justice or at least recognition. Joel taught that waiting for these things before forgiving is giving your power away completely. You're making your freedom dependent on someone else's consciousness shift. True forgiveness is unconditional, meaning it doesn't require any conditions to be met. The other person doesn't need to know, care, or change for you to be free. This is the ultimate spiritual maturity, releasing your need for them to validate your experience. You validate your own experience. You honor your own pain. You give yourself the acknowledgement you're seeking from them. This self-validation is incredibly powerful and healing. Joel worked with many students whose offenders never apologized, and they still achieved complete freedom through the forgiveness practice. One woman forgave her deceased father, who never admitted his abuse. She realized she was waiting for a ghost to free her when she held her own keys all along. The moment she stopped requiring his admission, she stepped into her power. Your liberation never depends on another's participation. It depends only on your choice. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? As you advance in the forgiveness practice, Joel taught more subtle applications. One profound area is forgiving God or the universe for your suffering. Many spiritual seekers carry hidden resentment toward the divine for allowing tragedy, illness, loss, or injustice in their lives. This creates a barrier between you and grace thicker than any interpersonal grievance. You're essentially at war with reality itself. Joel gently brought this unconscious anger to light in his students. He'd ask, "Are you angry that God didn't protect you? Do you feel abandoned by the universe?" The honest answer was often yes, buried beneath spiritual platitudes. This divine unforgiveness manifests as inability to surrender, constant need to control, difficulty receiving help, or feeling perpetually unsafe in existence. You can't relax into life when you fundamentally distrust the intelligence behind it. The practice here is acknowledging your anger at the divine directly. Stop pretending you're fine with God's will when you're actually furious about how life unfolded. Joel encouraged students to have honest conversations with God, expressing all the rage, confusion, and hurt. The divine can handle your authentic feelings better than your fake acceptance. This honesty opens the pathway to genuine forgiveness of existence itself, which creates profound peace. Another advanced application is forgiving life for not meeting your expectations. You had a vision of how things should have unfolded, the career you'd have, the relationship you'd find, the health you'd enjoy, the recognition you'd receive. When reality delivered something different, part of you stopped participating fully in the life you actually have. You're grieving the life you didn't get while missing the gifts in the life you did get. Joel called this the forgiveness of disappointed dreams. It's subtle but powerful. You must release your attachment to how you thought things would be to fully embrace what is. This doesn't mean abandoning healthy goals, but it means making peace with the present moment even while working toward change. You forgive life for being life, messy and unpredictable and often different from your plans. The practice involves gratitude for what is rather than fixation on what isn't. Each time you catch yourself comparing your reality to your expectations, pause and find 3 things to appreciate about your current circumstances. This trains your consciousness to find treasure in the terrain you're actually walking, rather than constantly wishing you were somewhere else. This forgiveness of reality itself is tremendously liberating and often opens unexpected doors. Joel also taught the forgiveness of collective wounds, ancestral pain, cultural trauma. Sometimes the unforgiveness you carry isn't even personally yours. It's inherited from your lineage or absorbed from your community. You're carrying grudges that belong to your great-grandparents. Resentments passed down through generations like heirlooms of suffering. This unconscious burden weighs heavily on your consciousness, without you understanding why you feel so angry about things that didn't happen directly to you. The practice here requires acknowledging what you've inherited. Sit quietly and ask, what pain am I carrying that isn't mine? What anger belongs to my ancestors? Let the answers surface without judgment. Then consciously forgive on behalf of your entire lineage. Say, I release all ancestral unforgiveness. I free my family line from resentment. I am the generation that breaks this chain. This declaration shifts energy, not just for you, but backwards and forwards through time. Students reported profound shifts from this practice. One man realized his rage toward authority figures was actually his grandfather's unprocessed anger at injustice. Once he forgave on behalf of his lineage, his own relationships with bosses transformed completely. You're not just healing yourself through forgiveness, you're healing your entire ancestral line. The spiritual benefit ripples through generations in both directions. This is forgiveness as a sacred healing power. The most advanced forgiveness practice Joel taught is the present moment release. Instead of waiting until you're wounded to practice forgiveness, you cultivate a consciousness that doesn't take offense in the first place. This is Christ consciousness, where you see everyone acting from their highest available understanding in each moment. You recognize that judgment itself is the wound, not the external action. When you stop judging, there's nothing to forgive. This doesn't develop overnight. It's the fruit of years practicing forgiveness. Eventually, your consciousness becomes so identified with your divine nature that personal offenses can't stick. Someone's rudeness, dishonesty, or betrayal is immediately seen as their suffering, not your injury. You feel compassion rather than anger, concern rather than resentment. This isn't spiritual bypassing, it's genuine transcendence of the personal self. Joel embodied this consciousness increasingly as he matured spiritually. Students would test him with provocations, and he'd respond with such impersonal love that they'd see their own ego in contrast. He wasn't trying to be saintly. He simply lived from a consciousness that knew his identity as infinite divine being couldn't be threatened by anyone's temporary confusion. This is the ultimate freedom forgiveness creates, liberation from the tyranny of taking things personally at all. As you approach mastery of the forgiveness practice, Joel taught that your entire life becomes a meditation on release. Every moment presents micro-opportunities for forgiveness. The driver who cuts you off, the clerk who's rude, the family member who disappoints, the friend who forgets your birthday. These small daily irritations are your training ground for consciousness transformation. Handle these minor offenses with immediate forgiveness, and major wounds won't accumulate. This continuous forgiveness prevents the buildup of resentment that calcifies over years into bitterness. You're living in real-time release, not allowing anything to stick in your consciousness long enough to create energetic knots. Joel compared it to washing dishes immediately after eating versus letting them pile up for weeks. Fresh forgiveness is easy. Old hardened unforgiveness requires intense scrubbing. Stay current with your forgiveness practice. The way you practice this daily is through awareness. Notice when irritation arises, even subtle annoyance. Instead of indulging the story about why you're justified in feeling irritated, immediately forgive and release. You don't need to make a big production of it, just a quiet inner statement. I release this, I'm free, I forgive. This takes seconds, but saves you from accumulating toxic energy that will eventually require intensive forgiveness work to clear. Joel witnessed the ultimate transformation in students who embraced forgiveness as their spiritual identity. They became instruments of grace in the world, naturally extending mercy because they lived in it themselves. Their presence was healing because they carried no judgment. People felt safe around them, could be authentic without fear of condemnation. This is the gift your forgiveness practice gives not just to you, but to everyone you encounter. This transmission of forgiveness consciousness is subtle, but powerful. You don't preach about forgiveness, you embody it. Your energy field radiates acceptance and release. People in your presence find themselves spontaneously forgiving old wounds because your consciousness invites theirs upward. This is how spiritual transformation spreads, not through teachings but through presence. You become a living demonstration of what freedom from resentment looks like. Joel emphasized that this isn't about becoming perfect or never feeling hurt. Even at this level of consciousness, you'll have moments of disappointment, frustration, or pain. The difference is these feelings move through you quickly rather than lodging in your system. You feel them fully, but don't build identity around them. They're weather passing through your sky, not the sky itself. This fluidity is the hallmark of advanced forgiveness consciousness. The practical outcome of sustained forgiveness practice is a life of increasing ease and joy. Energy previously locked in resentment becomes available for creativity, love, and purpose. Your relationships deepen because you're not defending against past hurts. Your health improves as chronic tension releases from your body. Opportunities appear because your vibration attracts matching circumstances. Forgiveness is the most practical spiritual practice for transforming your entire life experience. Joel saw countless examples of this transformation. Students who'd been stuck for decades suddenly made quantum leaps in their lives after clearing old resentments. Jobs manifested, relationships healed, health issues resolved, financial abundance flowed. This wasn't magical thinking, it was energetic reality. When you free up massive amounts of life force previously devoted to maintaining grievances, that energy has to go somewhere. It goes into creating the life you actually want. The key is consistency without attachment to outcomes. Practice forgiveness because it's your commitment to freedom, not because you're trying to manipulate reality for specific results. The benefits come as natural byproducts of a consciousness no longer bound by resentment. Trust that as you clear the inner obstacles, the outer path reveals itself. Joel promised his students that persistent forgiveness practice would transform their lives. And it did. It will transform yours too. So here's your complete path forward with Joel Goldsmith's teaching on forgiving 70 times 7. Begin today with one person, one situation that still carries emotional charge. Commit to forgiving as many times as needed over the coming weeks and months. Use the techniques shared here: impersonalization, substitution of love for judgment, meditation of release, journaling and ritual. Be patient with yourself and trust the process. Remember that forgiveness frees you, not the other person. Every act of release is an act of self-love and spiritual maturity. You're not condoning harmful behavior. You're choosing peace over perpetual pain. You're reclaiming your energy from the past to invest in your present and future. This is your birthright as a divine being. Freedom from the prison of resentment. Walk through the door that forgiveness opens. Joel's final word on forgiveness was this: make it your daily spiritual practice, not a one-time event. Live in a consciousness of continuous release, immediately forgiving small irritations before they calcify into major wounds. Become a presence of grace in the world by embodying the freedom you wish to experience. Your forgiveness heals not just you, but everyone you touch. This is your contribution to elevating collective consciousness. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path. What if I told you that the two words, "judge not," hold the complete secret to spiritual transformation? Not as a moral rule to follow, but as a mystical key that unlocks healing, abundance, and inner peace. Joel Goldsmith discovered this wasn't about being nice or tolerant. It was about understanding the very nature of God's universe and how we block divine flow through judgment. Most people think judging means criticizing others harshly, but Joel revealed something far deeper. Every time you label anything as good or bad, sick or healthy, rich or poor, you're actually separating yourself from spiritual reality. You're placing your human opinion above divine truth. And in that moment, you close the door to miracles. The mystical secret is this: judgment creates the very conditions you're judging. When you see someone as sick, you reinforce sickness in consciousness. When you see lack, you perpetuate lack. Joel taught that spiritual vision means looking through appearances to the divine reality behind everything. This isn't positive thinking. It's recognizing what already exists in God's perfect creation. Joel Goldsmith spent decades practicing this principle in his healing work. He would sit with people suffering terrible diseases, financial ruin, or emotional torment. But he trained himself never to accept the appearance as reality. He wouldn't see the person as sick or poor or troubled. Instead, he recognized only their spiritual perfection. This takes tremendous spiritual discipline. Your human mind wants to immediately judge and categorize everything. Someone looks ill, so you think they're sick. Someone acts angry, so you label them as a difficult person. But Joel discovered that every judgment you make actually gives power to the illusion rather than the truth. Here's what makes this transformational. When you stop judging, you stop creating. You stop reinforcing the human condition with your consciousness. Instead, you become a clear channel for divine reality to express itself. The healing isn't something you do. It happens naturally when you remove your judgmental thinking from the equation. Let me show you how this works practically. Imagine someone close to you seems depressed and struggling. Your natural human response is to see them as depressed, worry about them, perhaps try to fix them. But every thought that accepts their depression as real actually reinforces it in the invisible realm of consciousness. Joel's approach was radically different. He would recognize that God knows nothing of depression. In divine consciousness, this person is already perfect, whole, and filled with life. The appearance of depression is just that, an appearance, not ultimate reality. By refusing to judge it as real, you stop feeding it with your consciousness. This doesn't mean ignoring practical help or being uncompassionate. It means you help from a foundation of spiritual truth rather than acceptance of the problem as real. You see past the appearance to what's eternally true. And mysteriously, when one person holds this unjudging consciousness, it often precipitates healing in another. The reason this works goes to the heart of mystical Christianity. Joel understood that there's only one consciousness, one mind, which is God's mind. When you judge, you're operating from the illusion of separation, as if your human opinion matters more than divine reality. But when you release judgment, you align with the one consciousness. Think about Jesus saying, "Judge not," alongside his healings. He never accepted disease or lack as real. He saw through appearances to spiritual truth. When he said the blind man could see or the lame could walk, he wasn't changing reality. He was recognizing what was already true in God's perfect creation, and that recognition became visible. This is your power too. Not through trying hard or having great faith, but through the simple practice of withdrawing your judgmental consciousness from appearances. Every time you catch yourself judging anything or anyone, pause and ask what God knows about this. In that pause, transformation begins. Let me share what happened with a student named Andrew who applied this principle to his failing business. For months he'd been judging his situation constantly. Not enough customers, too much debt, competitors doing better. Each judgment felt true based on appearances, but each judgment also locked those conditions in place through his consciousness. When Andrew learned Joel's teaching, he began a radical practice. Every time fear arose about his business, instead of judging it as failing, he would stop and recognize, God knows nothing of failure. In divine reality, infinite supply flows constantly. The appearance of lack is an ultimate truth. He practiced this dozens of times daily for weeks. The shift didn't happen overnight, which is important to understand. For about 3 weeks, nothing changed externally. But Andrew noticed his inner state transforming. Less anxiety, more peace, even when circumstances looked the same. He was training his consciousness to stop reinforcing the problem through judgment. Then, almost mysteriously, things began shifting. A former client returned unexpectedly. A new opportunity appeared from nowhere. Within 2 months, his business had completely turned around. Not because he tried harder, but because he stopped judging and blocking divine flow with his limited human opinions. Another powerful example comes from a woman named Sophia dealing with a painful relationship. Her adult son had become distant and angry, barely speaking to her for over a year. Every time she thought of him, judgment flooded her mind. He's being unfair, he's holding grudges, he needs to change, our relationship is broken. Joel would say that every one of those judgments, even though they felt justified, was actually maintaining the separation. Each time Sophia judged the relationship as broken, she gave power to brokenness. Each time she saw her son as angry, she reinforced anger in consciousness. The judgments felt like observations, but they were actually creative acts. Sophia began practicing non-judgment rigorously. When thoughts of her son arose, instead of rehearsing the problems, she would recognize, in God's reality, love is the only presence. This relationship exists in divine perfection right now, regardless of appearances. The separation I see isn't ultimate truth. She did this for months, even when it felt pointless. Gradually, something shifted in the invisible realm. Her son called unexpectedly one evening. The conversation was brief, but warm. Over the following months, connection slowly restored. Sophia realized the healing didn't come from changing him or fixing the relationship. It came from her withdrawing judgment and allowing divine reality to be revealed. Here's what makes this practice so challenging yet so powerful. Every appearance in your life will tempt you to judge. Someone cuts you off in traffic, your body shows symptoms, your bank account looks insufficient, someone criticizes you. In each moment, judgment feels completely appropriate and true. But Joel discovered that spiritual mastery means recognizing that all these appearances exist in the human realm of effect, not in the divine realm of cause. When you judge them as real and powerful, you're actually creating more of the same conditions. You're using your consciousness to reinforce illusion rather than truth. This is why Jesus could walk through violent crowds untouched, why Joel could sit with terminal illness and see healing. They had trained their consciousness not to accept appearances as reality. They looked at the human scene without judging it as powerful or real, and therefore it had no power to harm or limit them. You have this same capability. It's not about denying practical reality or pretending problems don't exist in the human experience. It's about knowing that behind every appearance, divine perfection is the only truth. And when you stop judging the appearance, you stop maintaining it with your consciousness. The transformation available through non-judgment is immediate and practical. Right now, you can look at any situation in your life that seems problematic. Instead of judging it as bad, lacking, sick, or wrong, pause and recognize what exists in God's consciousness. In divine reality, only perfection, wholeness, abundance, and harmony exist eternally. This practice will feel uncomfortable at first because your human mind is trained to judge everything constantly. You'll catch yourself judging dozens of times daily, but each time you notice and withdraw the judgment, you're opening a door for divine reality to flow through. You're removing your limited human consciousness from blocking miracles. Start with small things: traffic, weather, minor annoyances. Practice seeing them without judgment, recognizing that in God's universe, only perfection exists. As you develop this spiritual muscle with small situations, you'll find it becomes available for the larger challenges life presents. If this mystical key to transformation resonates with your soul, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's teachings, subscribe for more profound spiritual wisdom, and comment, which judgment are you ready to release today? Beyond the basic practice of non-judgment, Joel taught a complementary technique he called seeing with spiritual vision. This means training yourself to look at every person and situation and consciously recognize their divine nature first, before any human appearance registers. It's like developing new spiritual eyes. When you meet someone, your human senses immediately register age, appearance, mood, status. But spiritual vision means looking past all that to recognize, this is God's perfect expression, right here, right now. The body I see is temporary, but the spiritual being is eternal and flawless. This isn't pretending or imagining. It's seeing what's actually true. Joel would practice this constantly throughout his day. Looking at people on the street, he would silently recognize their divine perfection. Hearing news of world problems, he would see past appearances to the spiritual truth underneath. This wasn't naive or escapist. It was the most practical thing he ever did, because it kept his consciousness clear and aligned with reality. Another powerful technique Joel taught was living in the secret place. This means maintaining an inner sanctuary of unjudging consciousness even while dealing with the outer world's demands. You might be handling business problems, family challenges, or health concerns in the human realm, but inwardly you remain in that place where no judgment exists. This secret place isn't a location but a state of consciousness. It's where you know that despite all appearances, God's perfect universe is the only reality. Problems may seem to exist in time and space, but in the eternal now of divine consciousness, only wholeness exists. You handle practical matters while anchored in spiritual truth. Joel described this as living in two worlds simultaneously. Your body moves through the human experience with its apparent problems and solutions, but your consciousness dwells in the realm where God's perfection is all that exists. The secret place protects you from being overwhelmed by appearances because you know they're not ultimate reality. Practice this by creating moments throughout your day where you consciously retreat into this inner sanctuary. Even 30 seconds of recognizing divine perfection behind all appearances will refresh your consciousness and prevent judgment from accumulating. Joel also taught what he called the practice of recognition. This is actively training your mind to recognize God's presence in everything before your human judgment can label it. Someone appears angry, and before you judge them as an angry person, you recognize God's peace is the only presence here. You feel physical discomfort, and before judging yourself as sick, you recognize, God's perfection is my true nature. This recognition isn't affirmation or positive thinking. You're not trying to change anything or make something true. You're simply acknowledging what's already eternally true in divine consciousness. The practice is remembering rather than creating, recognizing rather than achieving. Start each morning with 5 minutes of recognition practice. Look at your day ahead and consciously recognize God's presence in every planned activity and interaction. This sets your consciousness in a non-judging state before you encounter situations that might tempt you to judge. The final complementary practice is what Joel called resting in is. Instead of thinking about how things should be or could be or will be, you rest in the eternal is of God's perfect presence. Right now, in this very moment, divine perfection is, not was, not will be, but is. Judgment always involves time. This was wrong, this should change, this will improve. But spiritual truth exists only in the eternal now. When you catch yourself judging any situation, shift immediately to is. What is true right now in God's consciousness? Perfection is, wholeness is, love is, supply is. You're not waiting for these to become true. You're recognizing they're true right now, regardless of appearances that suggest otherwise. This practice of resting in the eternal brings tremendous peace because you stop living in the mental torture of judging what was or what should be. You anchor in what eternally is, which never changes because it's divine reality itself. Practice this throughout your day. Pause, release judgment, and simply rest in the is of God's presence. Now let's address the challenges you'll face practicing non-judgment, because being realistic about obstacles is crucial for success. The first major challenge is that your mind has been judging automatically for decades. You've built powerful neural pathways that instantly categorize everything as good or bad, right or wrong. Breaking this pattern takes persistent effort. In your first weeks of practice, you might catch yourself judging and feel frustrated. I'm failing at non-judgment. I'm judging that I'm judging too much. This is completely normal. The key is not to judge your progress. Simply notice when judgment happens, release it without self-criticism, and gently return to spiritual vision. Progress is gradual. Expect to forget this practice completely for hours or even days at a time. Your habitual consciousness will reassert itself. When you realize you've been judging everything again, don't despair. Just begin again in that moment. Joel himself said spiritual practice is really about beginning again thousands of times. Another significant challenge is that other people will constantly invite you to judge with them. Someone complains about politics, and they expect you to agree with their judgments. Someone gossips about a mutual acquaintance, wanting you to join in judging that person. Social pressure to judge together is enormous in human relationships. Joel's advice was to maintain your non-judging consciousness silently without preaching to others or making them wrong for judging. You can listen compassionately without agreeing with judgments. You can acknowledge someone's feelings without confirming their negative assessments. You remain inwardly anchored in spiritual truth while being kind in human interaction. This takes social skill and wisdom. You're not announcing "I don't judge" in a superior way, which would itself be a judgment. You're simply maintaining your inner awareness that divine perfection is the truth behind whatever appearances are being discussed. Sometimes you might gently offer a more spiritual perspective, but often you simply hold the truth silently. Perhaps the hardest challenge is practicing non-judgment with your own body and circumstances. When you're experiencing pain, financial pressure, or relationship conflict, it feels completely unrealistic not to judge these as problems. Your human self screams that these are real issues requiring real solutions, and non-judgment seems like dangerous denial. Joel understood this deeply. He taught that you absolutely handle practical matters in the human realm. See doctors, pay bills, have necessary conversations, but while doing so, maintain your inner knowing that these appearances aren't ultimate reality. You can take human action from a consciousness that doesn't accept the problem as permanently real. This is the middle path, neither denying practical needs nor accepting appearances as spiritual truth. You might take medicine while knowing that in God's reality, perfect health is already established. You might look for employment while recognizing that infinite supply is your true nature. The human action and spiritual knowing coexist without contradiction. The breakthrough comes when you realize that non-judgment isn't about perfecting your thoughts, but about catching yourself sooner when judgment happens. At first, you might judge for hours before noticing. Then you catch yourself after minutes. Eventually, you notice judgment arising and can release it immediately. This progressive awareness is the real transformation. Joel emphasized that even catching yourself judging 3 times a day instead of being lost in judgment constantly represents tremendous spiritual progress. You're developing a witness consciousness that can observe your judgmental thinking without being controlled by it. This witness is your spiritual self emerging. Be especially gentle with yourself around physical symptoms or financial concerns. These appearances have biological and social reality that makes them harder to see through. Start with easier things like traffic or weather. Build your non-judgment capacity, then gradually apply it to more challenging situations as your spiritual strength grows. If these challenge-breaking insights speak to your spiritual journey, like to support this transformative content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment. Which obstacle feels most real in your practice right now? Let's explore how non-judgment transforms daily life at advanced levels. Consider someone like Vincent, who had practiced Joel's teachings for several years. He'd reached a point where he could catch judgment quickly in most situations. Then he faced his deepest test. His wife received a serious medical diagnosis that doctors said was terminal. Everything in Vincent wanted to judge this as catastrophic, real, and terrifying. The medical evidence seemed overwhelming. But years of practice had built his capacity to see beyond appearances. He sat with his wife and silently practiced. In God's consciousness, only life exists. This appearance of disease isn't ultimate truth. I will not judge this as real and powerful. This didn't mean denying medical reality or refusing treatment. His wife received excellent care, but Vincent maintained his unjudging consciousness throughout, never accepting the diagnosis as the final word. He saw his wife as spiritually perfect regardless of physical symptoms. For 18 months he held this vision when fear threatened to overwhelm him. His wife's condition slowly stabilized, then gradually improved. Years later, she remains healthy and active, long past the time frame doctors predicted. Vincent knows the healing came not from denying medicine, but from refusing to empower the appearance through judgment. His consciousness remained a clear channel for divine reality to manifest. Another advanced application involves someone like Olivia, who extended non-judgment to world events and collective consciousness. She noticed how much of her mental and emotional energy was consumed judging news, politics, social problems. Every judgment drained her spiritual vitality and contributed to collective fear rather than collective healing. Olivia began practicing what Joel called holding the world in spiritual vision. When seeing troubling news, instead of immediately judging it as terrible and real, she would recognize, behind all appearances, God's harmony is the only truth. This doesn't mean the human suffering isn't happening in time and space, but it isn't the deepest reality. This practice transformed her from anxious and overwhelmed to peaceful and genuinely helpful. She could engage with world problems from a consciousness of solution rather than amplifying problems through judgment. She discovered that one person holding unjudging consciousness contributes more to healing than thousands judging and worrying. Joel taught that this is how consciousness actually works. It's not individual, but collective. When you judge, you add to collective judgment. When you see with spiritual vision, you add light to collective consciousness. Your inner work has outer effects far beyond what you can measure. Let's look at how non-judgment transforms work and creative expression. Someone like Benjamin, an artist, discovered that all creative blocks came from judgment. He would judge his work as not good enough, judge himself as lacking talent, judge the art world as unfair. Each judgment contracted his creative flow. When Benjamin applied Joel's principle, he stopped judging his creative process entirely. He would create without labeling results as good or bad, successful or failed. He recognized that creativity flows from divine consciousness, and his job was simply to be a clear channel, not a critic. Judgment interrupts flow. Non-judgment allows it. This doesn't mean Benjamin stopped discerning quality or improving his craft. but he separated practical refinement from judgmental thinking. He could see that a piece needed more work without judging himself or the work as inadequate. The shift was subtle but transformative, from judgment that contracts to awareness that expands. His artistic output increased dramatically, and paradoxically, the quality improved precisely because he stopped judging quality. When you're not blocking creative flow with judgment, your natural gifts express more fully. This applies to any work. When you stop judging yourself and your performance, you actually perform better because consciousness flows freely. The most advanced application of non-judgment is what Joel called living in the fourth dimension. This means your consciousness dwells permanently in spiritual reality while your body functions in the three-dimensional world. You literally see two universes simultaneously, the appearing world of effects and the true world of divine cause. Someone living in this consciousness, like Joel in his later years, moves through daily life without judging anything as ultimately real except God's perfection. Challenges arise in the human experience, but they're handled from a consciousness that knows their temporary appearances, not permanent reality. This brings a peace that truly passes human understanding. This isn't achieved through effort but through years of practice that gradually shift where your consciousness habitually dwells. You're not trying to live in the fourth dimension. You're removing the judgments that keep you locked in three-dimensional awareness. It's subtractive, not additive, releasing what blocks rather than acquiring something new. Joel described this as dying daily to the judgmental human self, so that your spiritual self, which never judges because it sees only truth, becomes your primary identity. This is the ultimate transformation available through the simple practice of judge not. It reveals your true nature as spiritual consciousness itself. Now we arrive at the total transformation that judge not brings when practiced consistently. You begin to live from what Joel called the infinite invisible, where your security comes not from visible circumstances but from invisible spiritual reality. Nothing in the appearing world can threaten you because you've stopped judging it as powerful. This doesn't mean you're detached or cold. Actually, you become more compassionate because you see people's struggles without judging them as victims of circumstances. You can help practically while knowing spiritually that their true nature is already perfect. This combination of human kindness and spiritual vision is what Joel called living the mystical life. Your entire relationship with life transforms. You're no longer constantly judging whether things are going well or poorly, whether you're succeeding or failing. You rest in the knowing that behind all appearances, divine perfection is unfolding exactly as it should. This brings profound peace even when the human experience includes challenges. The transformation extends to how you view your purpose and contribution. When you stop judging yourself and others, you naturally become a healing presence wherever you go. Your consciousness, clear of judgment, becomes a light that others feel even if they don't understand it. You don't have to do anything special. Your being itself becomes transformative. Joel lived this way in his later years. People would sit with him and feel their problems dissolve, not because he gave advice or tried to fix anything, but because his unjudging consciousness created a space where spiritual reality could be experienced. He proved that one person living in non-judgment does more good than thousands trying to improve the world from a judging consciousness. This can be your life too. Every moment you practice non-judgment, you're not just changing yourself. You're contributing to a shift in collective consciousness. You're demonstrating that there's another way to live, beyond the constant human habit of judging everything and everyone. You become what the world needs most, a clear space where divine reality can shine through. In practical terms, after months or years of practice, you'll notice you simply don't judge automatically anymore. Where once you had instant opinions about everything, now there's space. Where once you worried constantly, now there's an underlying peace. Where once you felt victimized by circumstances, now you know that your spiritual reality is untouchable by appearances. This doesn't mean you've perfected the practice. Even Joel said he had to begin again daily, catching himself when judgment arose. But the center of gravity in your consciousness shifts. You spend more time in spiritual awareness than in judgmental thinking. That shift is the transformation, gradual and genuine. Your relationships heal because you stop judging the people in your life as having problems they need to fix. Your health improves because you stop reinforcing symptoms through judgmental thinking. Your finances stabilize because you stop judging lack as real. Everything shifts not because you made it happen, but because you stopped blocking divine flow with judgment. The final truth Joel Goldsmith offers is this: judge not is the complete path. You don't need anything else. These two words, properly understood and practiced, will take you from human consciousness to spiritual consciousness, from suffering to peace, from seeking to finding. The entire mystical life is contained in releasing judgment. Every spiritual teacher in history has pointed to this same truth in different words. Jesus said, "Judge not." Buddha taught non-attachment to views. Krishna spoke of seeing the self in all beings. They all recognize that judgment is what separates us from experiencing divine reality that's already present. Your practice from this moment forward is simple. Notice when you judge anything or anyone. Pause. Recognize that in God's consciousness, only perfection exists. Release the judgment. Return to spiritual vision. Do this 10,000 times, and you'll find you've been transformed without trying to transform. You've simply removed what blocked your awareness of what you always were. Spiritual consciousness itself, infinite and free. If your spiritual understanding has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video to share this transformation, subscribe for more mystical teachings that actually work, and comment, "I am transformed," to affirm your commitment to living without judgment.